Hello, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Shannon Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Blacks and Jews in Conversation. Our special guest tonight is Renee Miat, attorney, professor, assistant district attorney before that, and member of the Judicial Commission on Minorities, Franklin Williams Commission, appointed by Judge Wackler of the Chief Court in New York State. And we're here for many issues. Primarily, I am being forced here to discuss a cartoon on our educated, distinct network. We have to discuss a cartoon, and I can't even draw. But that's one of the many issues that we're being forced to confront these days, as cartoons seem to be increasingly offensive. There was a day when cartoons were slap-happy, and now we're finding out that there is more to a cartoon than meets the eye. As we're an education network, we bring on experts in order to delve into the situation. We're not dealing with a situation where it is an offensive portrayal of a religious figure, where all of a sudden we can make comment on all religions except one. We're not into that situation. We're dealing with something that is considered far more seditious by a very large segment of the New York City population, and to those who may not know what they should. And for that reason, Renee is here, and she comes with enough distinguished credentials for all of us to pay attention. First of all, having been a professor, she did a lot of what our organization does, and she educates students, brings them into the courts, tours them, and promotes their careers and furthers advancement. At the same time, she has her own private practice, which is from soup to nuts. She has, as she's mentioned to me, clients from as far away as Sri Lanka. May that poor nation find some peace from its civil unrest with the tigers there. I don't know how many more days of disturbance they can endure. But she came from Bauer and Gardner. For those of you who don't know Bauer and Gardner, from my days of civil practice, this was like going up against Mount Everest without an ice pick. And I don't know how that firm came apart, but it was humongous. It was one of the towering giants. And it came apart before the dismal year of 2009. And she survived, and she's thriving. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Renee to tell you a little bit about the issues the Franklin Williams Commission confronts and her experience with the courts, and then we're going to delve into this, which is the New York Post cartoon. Some of you might have seen it. It says they'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill. Now, I originally thought it dealt with animal cruelty. I was offended by that. And they had two policemen, not the swiftest as depicted, pumping unnecessary amounts of bullets into a poor defenseless chimpanzee, pummeling it away, based on a real-life story where some hapless owner of the chimp had stabbed her with a butcher knife while it was attacking her friend, neither of which knew what to do with the situation, apparently, and the chimp ran into a police car for assistance, if you want to make light of it for a little bit, or maybe it really did run for assistance. It had been trained, and it was promptly shot. And now you can make what comments you want about the police, but that is apparently not the purpose of this cartoon, and for that we'll have Renee to explain it once she tells you a little bit about her background and the Franklin Williams Commission. Thank you. Renee.
Thank you, Shannon. My background consists of being an attorney in private practice. I'm a solo practitioner. I've been in practicing law for about 25 years, and been in private practice for about 14 or 15 years. And what it is that I maintain a general practice. So I do civil and criminal litigation. I am a litigator. I do real estate, wills, set up corporations, etc. I am formerly an assistant district attorney in the Bronx. I was up there for about 6 years, where I learned how to try cases and litigated cases throughout my entire tenure there. After leaving the district attorney's office, I went to Bauer and Gardner, and there I learned to litigate civil cases. and those were much more complex cases, and as Shannon has indicated, Baron Gardner was one of the towering giants at that time. And so as a result, as a trial attorney, you're always on trial, and that's what I was, and I had successes there. I participate currently in the Franklin Williams Commission on Minorities, and that's an organization that goes throughout the state of New York, and it holds hearings and conducts investigations with respect to issues that pertain to African Americans in the court system. Most recently, the commission sponsored a seminar dealing with gang violence, and last year we also did a symposium with respect to family and children issues. Shannon has been kind enough to ask me to come on and discuss this particular cartoon that has been the subject of much talk in the past few days. And I understand that as of as recent as today, that Rupert Murdoch has apologized for the depiction of the cartoon. And one can only, and I don't know, one can only think that the apology comes as a result of perhaps Mr. Murdoch recognizing that there was perhaps some ignorance with respect to understanding a culture and a people's sensitivity. One of the things that Shannon spoke about is that this particular conversation, if you will, Blacks and Jews in Conversation, and the organization is about education. And so I don't know anyone, or I know very few people who don't like to be educated, who don't like to learn. And so I think what happens is that when you have a cartoon that depicts an ape, and you have a cartoon that depicts police officers, and you have a cartoon that depicts the police officers shooting the ape, that you would hope that someone would be sensitive enough to a history, a people's history, to recognize that there should be some second guessing, or maybe even third and fourth guessing, as to whether or not we should actually put this particular cartoon in a newspaper. So the fact that Rupert Murdoch has come out and apologized, one would hope that he recognized that he needed to be educated and perhaps was not so at that particular time. What makes the cartoon so sensitive to many people, but particularly to African American people, is because there is a long history of blacks being treated in a very, very degrading way. What happens is that some of you who are attorneys, and some who are not, will recall that there was a time, a very famous case called Dred Scott. And in that particular case, in Dred Scott, there was a law that said that blacks did not have any rights that whites needed to respect. As a matter of fact, blacks were not even considered legal persons. That case was the law. And then if you go further down in history, or further towards this particular century, you see Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson spoke about blacks and whites and discussed this whole issue of separate and equal. But everyone knew back then that separate meant totally opposite of equal. It was separate and unequal. It wasn't separate and equal. So when you have a history of Dred Scott, and you have a history of Plessy versus Ferguson, and then as you come even further forward, and you have Jim Crow laws, where there are segregation. There are black water fountains or colored water fountains and white water fountains. There are separations in movie theaters and at lunch counters. There was a time, as a result of Jim Crow laws, that there's a movie, now I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but a black child, a child with no height, maybe about 8, 9 years old, if that old, opts to go into a pool during Jim Crow days. And when he gets into the pool, all the whites who are in the pool jump out of the pool. And what do? The owners of the establishment? They drain the pool. That was the thinking not so very long ago. And so what happens is when you recognize that history, and you recognize that there was a time when African Americans were called apes and chimps, referring to the color of a chimp, the size of the nose of an ape. Those were degrading comments and statements and pictures. And so to look up in 2009, when there is a African American who is President of the United States, to see a cartoon that is so insensitive that it doesn't recognize that there is a history with respect to an ape and a chimpanzee suggests that someone is being insensitive. And there is a saying that says a person who does not know their history, or anyone's history for that matter, is in danger of repeating it. And so when we look up in 2009 and we see this cartoon depicting an ape, we say that people have either forgotten their history or they don't know their history. And I know that if this were a situation, because it discusses stereotypes, that's what the cartoon suggests, stereotypes. And I know that if this were a different segment of the community, let's say for some reason this cartoon depicted Jews in an anti-Semitic way, if you will, I would imagine there would be such an outrage, such an outpouring of first dismay and then anger at a thought of how dare you be so insensitive to have a cartoon that shows us in such a degrading way. There are people who still believe today that the Holocaust never existed, and those people have to be educated. Jews will tell you, there's a saying that they have. They say never again. And that's no different. That's all African Americans are saying. When you have the outrage that you do now, they're saying never again. Don't repeat history. Not the history that is degrading and that is negative. Don't repeat that. I can imagine that if this were a different periodical, let's say this wasn't the New York Post, let's say it was the Amsterdam News, and the Amsterdam News depicted a cartoon that depicted Jews and anyone else in a very negative, or the perception that it was a negative way, that there would be a call for a closing of the newspaper. There would not be just boycotting of the newspaper, but in terms of marching around it, but people would opt not to purchase the newspaper. In Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks, and I know many of you know the story, when Rosa Parks opts to stay seated in the white section of that bus, there was a boycott. And there was a boycott because people were outraged. And people recognized that the majority were being insensitive to the plight of blacks. And what that boycott did, people opted for 385 days not to take the bus until there was change. So I can see a time now when someone says, you know what, I am so outraged by this cartoon that I have opted not to purchase the Post until an apology is rendered. And what happens as a result of the focus on the paper and trying to educate those who created the cartoon and those who approved it, it seems that we've gotten the apology from Rupert Murdoch, and we welcome that.
Let me ask you on that point, because I've had wonderful dealings with the Post over the years, and in fact my photographs have been published in it repeatedly, and they've covered our programs through Jerry Nachman in the past, and others, Eric Bettman, a classmate from high school, who I know are the most upstanding people and most upstanding characters. And I would never suggest that any of them would ever be involved in such things. And that's why it went right past me, because I would never suspect anything. I mean, Eric has participated with us in a program in 1999 in New York County Lawyers on the Rosenberg Committee with the late lamented Aaron Katz. A different point of view, of course, but that's the spice of life. But there is no point of view that would excuse the racism that you've discussed. And exactly as you said, that Sturmer, under the Nazis, went to all kinds of racial stereotypes of Jews that you will find in all kinds of anti-Semitic literature that persists today, which we fortunately don't see too much of, but still exists today. And of course, I would certainly lead a protest of that sort of thing, but you'll be surprised how many Jews would look the other way and would not have the strength and the courage to protest what a community standard should be and how people are depicted. But now that an apology has been issued, as you indicated, and that people's eyes have been opened to what a community believes is the correction that should be made of historical perception, do you believe that the Post has
You know, you would hope, and I don't know, because I'm not sure. You would hope that Rupert Murdoch, as a result of issuing the apology, recognized that there was some ignorance, and there was some insensitivity. But I don't know. And so because I don't know, you hope, and perhaps there's got to be something more that comes out of it other than the apology for folks to get to, I guess, be assured that one has been educated. But that the beauty of education is that it's ongoing. It's throughout life. One is educated. So the fact that this particular part and this particular time, Rupert Murdoch has been educated as a result of the outpouring of the outrage, I don't know if it's going to repeat itself later. But that doesn't mean the education stops. If that means, you know, that there are an exchange between Rupert Murdoch and the person who created the cartoon, and even the editor, and perhaps even some of the employees at the Post, where they're engaged in conversation, just like blacks and Jews are engaged in conversation. Perhaps there should be something similar to that happens at the Post, where there is an understanding and a sensitivity. I mean, that's what diversity programs are all about. You have diversity programs in the courts. You have diversity programs at Fortune 500 companies for the purpose of educating people, of reminding people that there is a history of negative, forget cartoons, but there is the history of showing a people in a very degrading, very demeaning way, and that unless that education continues, then we are doomed to repeat it. And that's what we don't want. So I hope that there has been an understanding and a learning, but I don't know.
I had suggested that op-ed pieces be sent in for publication representing the history that you've mentioned, because, as I said, being a member of many animal rights organizations, I thought it was about animal rights, and that when the caption said, let's find somebody else to write a stimulus bill, and they're shooting a chimpanzee, I imagine the stimulus bill, the only connection I could see, based on my ignorance of any other seditious intention here, is that the stimulus bill concerned environment, Barack Obama being so far extremely pro-environmental, thank God, and the chimp having been wiped out like other animals across the country, and the chimp, like other wild animals, which shouldn't be a pet, and we should try and strive not to have these things as pets. I thought that that's what they meant, a new stimulus bill without environmental protection. Obviously, I was naive. Obviously, I'm in a rare category based on my particular attraction to protect the environment and species and so on, and I don't have the position to make a judgment that this is not racist. That I don't have the knowledge. That has to come from the black community that had the experience and that was steeped in it and subjected to it. That's why your community has to speak out right away, as our community would were it Jewish affliction. And unfortunately, we don't have so many of those speakers. I'm sorry to tell you, we just don't. But we keep striving. I'm glad to see your community does. But I still believe that the Post is a very worthy entity, and as you can see, it didn't take long in coming for the head of the entire operation to get involved and to issue a retraction of sorts, as I've been led to believe. And of course, on this network, which is non-commercial and we're being not-for-profit, we don't advocate boycotts of anything. That's for other entities. And I certainly, with further dialogues, we have at Stuyvesant High School this Thursday from 8 to 11 in the auditorium. We have our annual Black History Month program, and I'm very glad you're joining us. And we welcome somebody from the Post or elsewhere to come and add their 2 cents. And we're having Judge Deborah Dowling from the Supreme Court in Kings, and Judge John Wilson from the Criminal Court, and maybe even comedians join us, and a student-faculty dialogue. And do you think that these dialogues actually further progress, or do you believe the protests on the street are more important, or is it a combination of the two?
Let me just say this, Shannon. I think that everyone has their own perception when they see anything. And I think that's the point and the purpose of education, is to open one's mind, to raise one's consciousness so that something you didn't see before, you now see. So when you pick up the comic strip and you look and you think it's about animal rights, that's your perception. Someone could laugh at you, think, you know, how silly, how could he possibly think it's about animal rights? But that's your perception. And so what happens is the beauty of even this conversation that you and I are having, it is about education. And it is letting you know that there is a different perspective, a different way to look at the comic, the cartoon, not from an animal rights perspective, but from a perspective that speaks directly and boldly and negatively about African Americans. So I think it's important for the dialogue to continue. But again, I think it's even more important for the Post and the employees of the Post, and again, particularly those who created the cartoon and allowed it to be published, to be part of that dialogue. Because the part, in terms of education, I would think that they would want to be educated. At least I would hope that they would want to be. And again, I would hope that they would participate, if not this week, then at some other time in some other venue, and be part of the dialogue that you're creating here.
In terms of the general attitude of the administration, was there any reaction from the federal administration to this? Were they silent on this? Is an administration usually silent on characterizations in newspapers when it's not just a political characterization, or did some spokesperson for the administration say, you know, about that New York Post cartoon, this is not appropriate?
You're referring to the Barack Obama administration? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
You know what happens, Shannon, I am a practicing lawyer. I am handling a caseload of at least 125 to 150 cases. And so as a result, I don't get a chance to follow all of what's happening in terms of the media and that sort of thing. And I don't know specifically, I don't work for the administration, so obviously I would not know if they came out and made a comment or issued a statement with respect to the cartoon. I wouldn't be aware of that. But what I can say is this, that any administration, whether it's Barack Obama or some other administration, would certainly be of the mindset that anything, whether it's a cartoon or anything else, that depicts any culture, whether it's African Americans, Jews, or anyone else, anything that fosters that kind of racism, that needs to be stopped, that needs to be discontinued, and there needs to be some not only conversation, but an apology, and a sincere apology. Not a half apology, a sincere apology that says that we recognize, we're sorry, we recognize that we perhaps were a little, not a little, but we were insensitive with respect to African Americans in your history. And so I think any administration that calls itself or is worthy of being voted in by the American people should, or if it has not, I'm sure that they are of the mind that this is not something, if it offends people, that it should not be something that should go on. An apology is warranted, and if the apology hasn't come, and it has come as we know of today, but there should be some recognition that education, I think any administration would support people being educated with respect to recognizing that there's another perception rather than one's own perception of things.
If we look at the progression of these things, first appeared the cartoon, and then the response was heard that how dare you print such a thing? And of course you had the immediate reaction, as I describe it, of circling the wagons and saying it's a cartoon, get over it, it's not as you say, it's some other whole interpretation. And then you have the people who have the antenna up for this sort of thing, and they attract more people, and the protest grows, and the wagons get tighter, and then the business decisions are impacted, and people of higher caliber start to reflect, and people study history, and eventually, if there's going to be people of goodwill and people of good sense, and the city is going to work together, you have the result that we did today. Now, does that for practical matters, does that soothe over things, or does it leave people on both sides saying this was a perfect freedom of expression on one side, and the other side saying, so now we know the vicious people we're really dealing with? Are we having a calming situation, or have we really, as you might say, exposed two armed camps?
I don't know that with respect to a calming situation. I think what's happening is this. When there was a time, you may remember this, Dr. King was sitting in a Birmingham jail, and he writes a letter from that jail. And he writes a letter to the clergy, and predominantly white clergy. And the reason he writes the letter is because the clergy, the white clergy, have been continuously telling him, you've got to wait. Don't make a fuss. This whole race thing is going to blow over, but you have to wait. And he continued to tell them, but we can't wait. But they continued to tell him, you must. It'll come eventually. They'll eventually see the light, and everything will be fine. And he wrote that letter, Shannon, because he wanted people, particularly the clergy, to understand why we can't wait. So when a person of Rupert Murdoch's caliber, and I don't know him personally, but if we think that a person of his caliber should be sensitive enough that if he sees the cartoon, that he says, you know what, we can't put this in our paper. And if someone takes the position, you know what, it's just a cartoon. If you take that position, then that is part of, if you forgive me, the ignorance that someone has. It is not just a cartoon. It is more than a cartoon, because in the cartoon is a history. Just looking at the cartoon, if you are a person of African American descent, you say, I recognize this. I have seen this. No matter how subtle somebody else may think it is, it's not subtle to me, because I know what it says. And the racism screams loudly. That's what it says to someone of African American descent. And so in terms of, you know, you finally get the apology. There is, what is being said here is that we never should have gotten to the point where there would have been the need for an apology, because the cartoon would not have been placed in the newspaper. Somebody at that newspaper would have looked at that and said, we can't do this. This, what is depicted here speaks volumes. And we can't be so insensitive to a community to forget that the feelings of race and being degraded is still fresh and still new. When Barack Obama was elected president, on the night of the election, there were people, African Americans, in tears. And they were in tears because they saw a history. They had flashbacks of a history. And that spoke loudly. And
I don't mean to cut you off, but we have only about 10 seconds. So I want to use those 10 seconds to thank you so very much for coming on, and to welcome you back in the near future, and to hope that the history marches forward and not backward.
Thank you.